My name is Rachel Monroe. With almost 20 years, I flew combat missions with the Air Force, accrued over 3,000 hours, and survived 2 deployments and 1 crash that still haunts me to this day. However, none of that was ever included in the family's Christmas letters, and it certainly didn't get me invited to my brother's burial. I parked 2 blocks from the chapel and walked the remaining distance in uniform beneath a civilian coat, after arriving shortly after sunrise. Nobody took notice. I had always been like a shadow that the family never really recognized, creeping in and out of their lives like that. The doors of the church were already open. The pews were lined with rows of polished shoes and black suits. Each seat has a printed program with gold embossment. Each page bore his name. Not even the acknowledgments included mine. They consistently claimed that I made decisions they didn't comprehend, that they found it difficult to relate to my journey. However, I never requested applause. All I wanted was to be important enough to be mentioned. My brother Daniel passed away unexpectedly. In his sleep, he had a heart attack. 44 years old. Not a warning. Like clockwork, the family came together. Perfect suits for perfect anguish, voicemail informed me. They were surprised that I showed up. Most likely thought I was too far and unreachable. They weren't corrected by me. I simply arrived. I sat in the far back, next to the stained glass window, behind the final line of mourners. We had been taken to the same church when we were children. As the preaching continued, I recalled using my fingertip to trace the fissures in the wooden benches. I use muscle memory to do that now as well. Up front, I could see my parents. My father was holding my mother's wrist like a punctuation point. Her expression was fixed, her eyes dramatic yet dry. The kind of grief that should be shown. It had been 4 years since I last saw them. The last time was at a family wedding, which I went to even though I wasn't invited. That was also the last time we had a quick, distant conversation like ambassadors from foreign nations. Still encased in the universe they created for themselves, they had not altered. One in which I represented the warning they didn't tell their new acquaintances, and Daniel represented the golden sun. I heard the eulogy, as well as anecdotes about Daniel's philanthropic contributions, his firm, and his coaching career in the minor league. They referred to him as a leader, mentor, and pillar even after he had been at the office for a whole week. I awaited the call of my name. It never materialized. Nobody looked back. Nobody muttered. I wasn't significant enough to warrant scandal or pity. I was a borrowed pew, a ghost. However, I failed to appear. Something had changed, and I remembered what it was like to be invisible. The silence they had hitherto relied on would shortly be disturbed. The respectful, well-practiced voice of the preacher reverberated around the chapel like a gentle command. He talked about Daniel as though he had been a CEO, a soldier, and a saint all at once. To portray a man who never faltered or failed, every syllable was flawless, and every story was carefully chosen. As I listened, I was well aware of how meticulously that version had been constructed. Daniel was charming. He was polished. In front of the appropriate people, he knew how to say the proper thing. Our parents crowned him before we were even teenagers because of that. Pearls were arranged like punctuation against my mother's collarbone in a fitted navy dress. Her makeup remained intact, but she occasionally dabbed at her eyes. As neighbors and former business associates muttered their condolences, my father remained with his hand on her arm and nodded sadly. They saw themselves as the curators of this gallery of misery. Every move was practiced, every reaction planned. This was a place for show, not for genuine grief. They stood for the family tribute, and I watched them. Instead of grieving for a son, my father cleared his throat and adjusted the microphone as if he were speaking to a boardroom. He commended Daniel's effect, his family values, and his work, and thanked everyone for attending. After concluding, he sat down and said, "We were fortunate to raise a son who made us proud every single day." The girl who used to construct Lego towns beside Daniel's train sets was not mentioned. No mention of the sister who once rescued him after he fell through a freezing lake. My existence remained intact. It just wasn't convenient. That was how it had always been. I received the leftovers and Daniel got the new bike. He attended a private school. I was awarded scholarships. They told friends that I was figuring things out when I enrolled at the age of 17. They made announcements when Daniel launched his first office. I stopped attempting to prove anything at one point. Not out of strength, but because if you sit with it long enough, fatigue feels a lot like acceptance. I no longer send out holiday cards. They ceased to pay attention. Other than Daniel's absence, nothing had changed today. As if I were the outside ring that no one remembered to draw, he drew them all closer together, even in death. The organist played a slow, melancholy tune. People shifted in their chairs, cleared their throats, and dabbed at tears. Observing my parents' backs, I pondered what it would have taken for them to ever express their pride in me. Perhaps if I had stayed, married young, and rooted myself in a familiar environment. However, they never looked for the person who did, and that version of myself never existed. A woman also approached, muttered something, and leaned in close to my mother. With a slight smile, my mother said, "Daniel always had a sense of purpose." Rachel was more restless. The woman nodded courteously. I felt my gut clench, but I remained motionless. Like I was a hurricane that couldn't stop moving. They used that word restlessly every time. Not a woman who helped stabilize injured pilots in dangerous terrain or carried lives across airspace. I remained seated until the recessional started, till the gleaming coffin passed by, and people said insignificant blessings. I chose to stay out of the parade. Along with the others, I did not enter the bright parking lot. Sometimes the only thing you can do is not give them what they anticipate, so I waited. At first, the sound was low, a constant rumble that drifted across the church roof like thunder in the distance. As the windows shook in their frames, people stopped in the middle of their stride and looked up. Some shifted uncomfortably, not sure if it was a service feature or anything else. The military jet flew overhead, banking hard before rapidly lowering altitude, and then it hit with a thunderous roar. A baby began to wail somewhere in the back as the stained glass rattled. As the jet appeared through the big windows, the room erupted in gasps. Gray steel, sharp angles, clearly government-issued. People turned toward the double doors at the back, pointed and whispered as phones came out. Just enough of the engine noise was muffled to allow for the next sound. Outside, a pair of boots is scuffing against the pavement. Then, with a hat tucked under his arm and an enigmatic expression, a uniformed officer entered through the open doors. He called Brigadier Monroe, his voice clear and piercing the astonished quiet. Your plea for immediate transportation was read as a priority, and everyone's heads turned and seats moved. When they finally saw what they had been pretending not to see for years, a few whispered my name. Without hurrying, I strolled into the aisle and folded my coat neatly across the back of the pew. As I stepped forward, the officer gave me a sharp salute and jolted to attention. I observed my mother's face freeze somewhere toward the front. My dad's mouth tightened. Near them, a woman canceled her program. I wasn't the one who showed up unobserved for the first time in years. The silent person in the back row wasn't me. They didn't know how to handle the fact that I was the headline they hadn't written. As I came down the aisle, I could still hear the jet's scream echoing in the rafters. Unsure of whether to move aside or just stare, people parted like water. Although no one talked, their eyes communicated louder than their mouths could. My father stood slowly in the front, as if his body needed time to adjust to the reality that was being presented. With her mouth slightly wide and a half-formed smile that she hastily swallowed, my mother blinked vigorously. For me, the officer held the door. I turned just enough to look them in the eyes before leaving. I didn't nod or grin. Instead, I let the quiet speak for itself. The stench of jet fuel and heat-burned grass filled the air outside. A man wearing a press badge had raised his camera and taken 3 fast pictures next to a black SUV that had driven up close to the church steps. I didn't recoil. The cop didn't either. However, behind me I heard whispers beginning to emerge, along with inquisitive queries, somewhat familiar titles, and a quiet voice asking, "Is that?" The photographer approached, obviously having been tipped off. He might have discovered something more significant after being dispatched to cover a local businessman's funeral. I witnessed his realization that I was now the story. As I crossed to the car, my boots made a clicking sound against the concrete. The door opened. I stopped to give the chapel one more glance. With my parents encircled by unscripted whispers, they remained motionless. I had never seen them uncertain about their role before. And when I got into the car, silently, proudly, and at last seen, but on my terms, I kept that image with me. A regular audit produced the alert. My pension report had a line item that didn't match the monthly deposit. Even though it was tiny and nearly unmemorable, something about it seemed strange. I retrieved the reports and compared years' worth of benefit transfers, signatures, and declarations. My digital ID was on one paper, but my authorization stamp was missing. That was not feasible. I didn't sign it. The specified date occurred during my most recent deployment, while I was in northern Syria off-duty and without access to security systems. Request after request, I dug further. I had never given civilian proxy permissions to several of them. A power of attorney form with my name and a signature I recognized but not mine was attached to one flagged entry. It was spotless, almost spotless. No pen drag, no inconsistent pressure, computer-generated, and not handwritten. I looked through the access log. In upstate New York, it started with a residential IP that triggered a home network with the name Montana Guest. My stomach plummeted at that point. My personal identifiers were accessible to only one Monroe household. My mother was still living at my parents' house. I asked the DoD pension system for complete beneficiary records. One name was underlined in yellow on a sealed file that came the following day. Each of the 3 identified accounts has secondary access listed. My mother is Margaret L. Manu. I clamped my jaw and gazed at the screen, trying to figure out what that meant. Either someone used her identity, or she was aware of what she was doing. In any case, the treachery originated within the circle. I requested any communication records connected to the flagged forms when I called the audit office. A transcript of a 2019 fax was forwarded by them. It approved emergency dispersals because of medical difficulties in the family. I hadn't used the landline that was advertised for 10 years. Once more, the signature block was mine, but it was too flawless. I asked an old JAG contact for a favor. She scanned the file forensically. She returned her call in a few hours. It's a fake. I sat at my desk with my hands clenched around a printout of the forged signature as she said, "Whoever did this had access to your full credential set, not just ID, but biometric templates. That kind of access doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from familiarity, from someone who thinks your name belongs to them." Betrayal was not always obvious. On government letterhead, it occasionally appeared in black ink. And my mother's name was on it this time. I didn't make a phone call. I entered the side gate, rang the bell like a stranger, and arrived at the house I hadn't been to in 6 years. The moment my mother's surprise flickered long enough to register, she answered in a robe with her hair fixed. "Rachel," she whispered, gently but cautiously, as if she wasn't sure which of me had appeared. Without asking, I went inside and set the printouts down on the kitchen table. With her lips squeezed into a narrow line and her eyes moving too quickly to act as though this was new knowledge, she read them silently. When she eventually answered, "It wasn't what you think," she folded her arms as if in defense. I answered, "Then tell me what it was," in a tight but even voice. She sighed as if I were exaggerating, but she didn't shudder. "Because it looks like you signed my name and rerouted thousands of dollars from my account. Your father had medical bills, Daniel's children needed assistance, and we were behind on the house." I said, "It was mine and it was just there." "You were gone," she murmured, her eyes tightening. "Not yours to use, not even to consider." I was astounded by how effortlessly she said, "Always gone." "We thought you wouldn't notice." As if my absence were a cause rather than a justification. As if it were merely a matter of logistics to remove me from the documentation. I said, "You didn't even ask, not once." She said it was only temporary. "You were always so proud." "No, you wouldn't have." "You're correct." She shrugged as I answered, "I wouldn't have." As I erased the one you sent away, her eyes sparkled, but she didn't answer. "It's not like we spent it on ourselves. It went to the family." "You spent it on the family you chose to keep," I added. The fact that it had been so easy for her to justify, not the money or the forgery, was the true wound. I left the documents on the table and left without saying another word. Some silences are earned while others are built, brick by brick, name by name. Today, mine was permanently removed from her wall. The Hall of Honor's rotunda was silent, save for the sound of boots on polished tile and the long beams of sunlight streaming across the marble floor. The walls were engraved with names, none of which had been mine until now. I stood at attention in full dress uniform, my medals lined up, and my service record read out loud without embellishment or omission, just facts. 17 deployments, 14 firefight rescues, 1 crash, no shortcuts. The officer who presented the medal had previously served next to me in Kandahar, and he kept his speech brief and precise, praising my distinguished service, operational excellence, and unwavering courage under fire. He then pinned the medal to my chest and took a step back, saying, "This moment wasn't built for my parents. They weren't there. It wasn't choreographed for family photo albums or hometown newsletters. It was for the ones who understood what it meant to survive, not just to be admired." Rows of uniforms filled the seats. I didn't come here to be seen. I came because I kept showing up even when it cost me. There was no applause, just the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that means you've said enough. After that, I walked alone through the lower corridor of Fort Caldwell, past restricted zones, past plaques, past reminders of the job and the people who gave more than I did. Some faces were familiar, others known, but every gaze is steady, and every nod means something. These weren't people who needed to be impressed. They just needed to know you'd earned your place. There was a black and white picture of me from my first mission, Operation Iron Crest, with 5 of us in the picture. Only 2 of us are still alive. I put my hand on the glass and let out a breath, not out of sadness, but out of gravity. There are ceremonies you don't get to go to, ones that are held behind your back, and ones that erase you. This wasn't one of those ceremonies, the one they couldn't change, a record they couldn't alter, a moment that didn't need their approval to matter. I had written my own story, and for the first time in a long time, it remained exactly where I left it. She came without a call. I answered, "Let her in," when the gatekeeper buzzed my office to let me know that Monroe, a civilian guest, was claiming family clearance. She looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the civilian clothes. Maybe it was the weight of knowing the script she'd rehearsed wouldn't work here. She carried a manila folder like it might fix something. I didn't offer her a seat, just stood behind my desk and waited. She took a breath, then said, "I never meant for it to feel like a betrayal." I didn't respond. She moved closer and put the folder on the desk, making it obvious that she was still confused by the word feel. She squared her shoulders and added, "We did what we thought was necessary at the time." "Everything's in there," she said. "Every transfer, every document. I've withdrawn from the accounts and closed the access. Still no apology, just math and paperwork." The notarization and the signatures were authentic this time, so I opened the folder and went through each page before closing it once more. "You won't be hearing from legal," I said, but she swallowed hard. "You're still part of this family, Rachel." "No," I said, voice even. I was a valuable asset until I stopped being useful. I slid the folder back across the desk. "This stays here." "You don't." She stopped, then gently took it up. "Is this permanent?" She seemed to want to fight, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she smiled tightly, much like she had at Daniel's funeral. "It's overdue," I murmured. She turned to face the door, stopped once, and continued walking. When the door clicked shut, I sat down and looked at the room she had left behind. It didn't feel empty. There were no tears or breakdowns, only distance. It was undamaged. Some farewells require clarity, not ceremony. Today I received mine. The office was silent, save for the steady click of my pen and the hum of the overhead light. I opened a blank folder and wrote my name at the top, Rachel Monroe. No titles or ranks, just the name, as it always should have been, unaltered, undiluted. I slipped in copies of the corrected records, one of my original oaths, one of the ceremonies, and a faded picture of the echo unit, with edges from years. The people who never asked me to prove who I was. Some names are spoken aloud, while others endure in silence. Mine had lived 2 lives. I used to believe that legacy was about who remembered you, what plaques bear your name, and what you choose when no one is looking. I've walked back into fire for people who never knew my name and still would because that's who I am. Not because of them, despite them. Tonight I closed the file and put it in a locked drawer, not to hide it, not to keep it. What matters now isn't that they forgot me, but that I never did. I carried myself all the way here, scar by scar, step by step, and in doing so, I reclaimed something that no one can erase: my name, my story, and me.